Reggie. Now, with great pleasure, let me introduce the next speaker, Dr. Venu Gopal. He'll be speaking on a topic which many among the audience sure will be keen to listen to, because though I don't envy his position there, because this is a topic which has got many gray areas. A lot of traditionally used medications should go out by now, and few new things have come. And I'm sure Dr. Venugopal will be able to clear most of the misconceptions we have, and many of the doubts many of the audience will be having. So over to Dr. Venugopal for the talk.
Thank you very much, chairpersons, for having given a good introduction, and congratulations to Kunjumoideen and for this wonderful initiative of the Reproductive Committee of KFOG. It's nice to see an activity like this, and I'm thankful for the talk that you have given me, because it is one of the things that every gynecologist, it's not just an infertility specialist, but every gynecologist has to deal with. Medical management of OAT. I try to put in a slide. This one probably symbolizes the plight of these patients who have oligoastinospermia. If you put it simply, oligocorvodona is feeling a little bit less, feeling weak, and feeling different from the others. So I think that's not a very pleasant situation to be in. Then when you go, as when you talk about, as we are reproductive medicine specialists, I think this talk would have been a little bit differently labeled. Maybe it should have been that medical management of OAT in the era of ART. Nowadays people have easy solutions out. If there's a count less, then people think that we are sitting in infertility clinics, we think that why not do an IUI for the patient, why not do an IVF for the patient. So in this era of ART, it's a little bit different, and all the more because these are few facts that give significance to this talk. That there's a genuine decline in semen quality over the past 50 years. You may debate it or not, but that's true. It's not only there in India, but across the world, this is a sort of a problem that is there. So more and more patients are coming, and then male infertility is very much on the rise. And you have to offer solutions. You need not be an infertility specialist. You can be a gynecologist. Every time you don't have to send patients to a urologist or something. You should be aware of a few basics. Now, see, I told you that we have easy options available for the patients. We can offer them IUI, we can offer these patients IVF. That's all right. But then there are many things which dictate the treatment that you offer, and one of the biggest ones is the socioeconomic status of the patient. So whatever you say, that there's this treatment, that treatment available, it's the depth of the pocket that many times determines that the way the patient approaches. And then of course the psychosocial pressures and emotional aspects, all of them add on to this particular problem, none of which could be neglected. So when I come to if somebody would ask me that how would you sum up the medical management of infertility, which is so vast in itself, you have to have your basic concepts correct. I think these four things, if these four words, or these four, whatever you may call it, if you have got it right, then you will get many aspects of medical management of male infertility corrected. First one is the oxidative stress and its relevance in male infertility and its effect on the count. The second is the testosterone estradiol ratio. I think you would have had fleeting glimpses in the previous two talks, people talking about some TE ratio, and then just cutting it across because we don't discuss it so much. Then the third is, when we are dealing with medical management of male infertility, we need to know a bit about gonadotropin therapy. And then, of course, you need to have the realization that most of the things that we are giving males currently falls under the category of empiric therapy. That is, we think they are beneficial, they may be beneficial, many times they may not be beneficial. And then the reasons for male infertility is many times idiopathic. That is, you have not defined the causes to the core. So I think these four things, other than the talk, just these four things will summarize my talk today. I will come to oxidative stress, okay? So now oxidative stress is now an emerging explanation for several causes of male infertility, not one, and it's very significant. See, if you're knowing about Agarwal and team, they do a lot of research in male infertility, and then they said 40 to 80% of infertile men have elevated markers for oxidative stress. have elevated markers for oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is very much there. And then there is this new terminology, there's this new terminology that has been developed, which is called male oxidative stress male oxidative stress infertility, or MOSI. So because we don't go into depth of andrology, we are away from this. But then see, this is a very recent article, 2019. That's 2 years. So idiopathic infertility. That is, you don't find any reason for infertility, and then it's very likely that you're dealing with male oxidative stress infertility, and it affects a large number of patients, especially those with idiopathic infertility. Males, the count will be all right, but then they don't conceive, and then this is probably one of the reasons for that. Once you understand that, then automatically you have this question in your mind, that what is it that's causing so much of this oxidative stress, right? Yeah, what's it that causes so much of oxidative stress? It could be from exogenous sources, very common nowadays: stress, smoking, alcohol, toxins, or from endogenous sources, varicocele, and pus cells in the semen, immature sperm. All of these contribute to oxidative stress. Okay. Now, see, oxidative stress in itself is a very expansive topic to be discussing with. But you will ask that why does oxidative stress affect the sperm? That is, you should remember that the sperm has got DNA. There's got two strands. It's double stranded. Okay. So what oxidative stress or reactive oxygen species do is they cause fragmentation of DNA. Just remember that much. That will cause DNA fragmentation. And second is apoptosis of spermatozoa. That's even more important. Why it decreases the cell sperm count. That is, apoptosis means programmed cell death. So a cell that is programmed to die. So you will see a lot of sperms that are running around and moving, but then they have been programmed to die, and they are apoptosis. So that's why the sperm function is deteriorated, and this is the main effect of reactive oxygen species. So what do you do if you see reactive oxygen species? Then the question arises: to whom, how, and for how long do you give antioxidants? So there's actually oxidative stress, you got to give antioxidants. Yeah. See, the biggest criticism of prescription of antioxidants up till now was that how do you measure oxidative stress? How do you know that there's oxidative stress? Okay, there's varicocele, there's this. How do you know there's oxidative stress? So abroad, see, when you listen to talks like this, you look for always updates. Okay, so when you see that, see, this is a system that has been developed abroad by the same Dr. Agarwal and team. They're going about very systematically, and naturally it's bound to come to our country and our practice also. It's called the Meoxis system. For the first time, I think they have a reliable system which measures the redox potential, it's called. So that will give you an idea of oxidative stress. I just put this here so for future reading we won't spend much time. But if somebody asks you how do you know there's oxidative stress, yeah, there are systems being developed to come to know whether there's oxidative stress. And then nowadays most of the therapeutics are based on systems like this. Now, how do we use antioxidant therapy? Now, I don't have access to Meoxis system. So what do I do when I suspect oxidative stress? I will focus on few things. Three principles. First, identifying the source of the stress. Then, many a times it's infection. We misdiagnose infection, prevent misdiagnosis of infection, and then select an antioxidant formulation and a dosage, whatever suits me appropriately. Okay, so there will be specific medical therapies. For example, for genital tract infections, you have to treat them specifically before just giving a blanket prescription of an antioxidant. See, genital tract infections, these are all topics in itself, but we should remember that in infertile male, try and identify if there's some real cause. Is there a varicocele? Then that needs treatment. Otherwise, don't just try to go around and give antioxidants randomly. Okay. There are a lot of antioxidants. See, you have 100 companies, they'll have 200 antioxidants. This all falls into the category of antioxidants, and you may choose plus or minus depending upon whatever suits you. Actually, to tell you the truth, even vitamin E and vitamin C many often times suffices. It suffices. And then there's nothing that's specific or proven as such. But if you were to know the theory, you should know that the antioxidants, they're classified into two groups: the catalytic and the scavenging. Okay, the vitamin C and the vitamin E belongs to the scavenging category, and there are other catalytic ones also. So there are different variants. Every day you have companies and people coming and telling you this antioxidant is best, that is best, permutations, combinations costing a lot of money. But then see, previously there was a lot of skepticism about the role of antioxidants, but by now it's by and large established after this term MOSI was coined, that antioxidants do play an important role in male infertility, and they have a role in improving the crown morphology, and decreasing the damage. Now that DNA fragmentation steps studies, they have helped us to realize the importance of antioxidant therapy. How many days of antioxidant to give? See, this is a basic fundamental we should understand. You cannot have a prescription for 15 days, right? Because the sperm production cycle occurs in a mean 64 plus or minus days. So minimum 2 to 3 months. 3 months if you want your antioxidant to work. If you started something, might as well continue. So, see, this is a Cochrane database review that that it's found that these agents improve pregnancy rates and in DNA damage. Though at the end of each of these studies, it will be mentioned that the quality of evidence is low. That means there are no properly conducted studies as such. But then antioxidants do have a place in male infertility. In the previous talk, I saw that that there was a question asked by one of the persons that is there any problem with excessive use of antioxidant therapy. See, many a times you see patients carrying large bags of 6 months, 8 months of just antioxidant after antioxidant, one antioxidant, another antioxidant by another name. There's something called antioxidant paradox. Just keep it at the back of your mind, and there is a thought process that the excessive use of antioxidants does itself be able to cause male infertility, because just like there's an oxidative potential, there's also what is called a redox balance. There should be while so you should also remember the question was very relevant, that it's not that you can go on taking antioxidants just like that. There is something called antioxidant paradox, and then if you have just like oxidative stress, there's something called reductive stress, and then if that happens also, that can also be is being implicated as one of the causes for infertility. So don't let's not try and freelance ourselves with the use of antioxidants. Now the next see we I discussed antioxidants. Now the next thing I plan to from today's talk is to understand the importance of what is called as testosterone estradiol ratio. Okay, so we won't go too much into endocrinology. Okay, so that it's spermatogenesis, and then you need testosterone. See, this is too much of a crowded slide, and then but you need to know that you need testosterone for every aspect of spermatogenesis, and then there's a lot of importance for intratesticular testosterone in the seminiferous tubules, and then there's testosterone in the circulation. Ultimately, this testosterone is converted into estradiol by an enzyme called aromatase. Okay, I'm just harping on this because for gynecologists, very often we don't read our endocrinology books. But then see, when we are talking about testosterone estradiol ratio, we need to understand these concepts very correctly. You need testosterone, you need aromatase, and you need estradiol. Okay, so similarly, estradiol and aromatase are also important. Estradiol also is important for the development and function of Leydig cells, maturation. These are all dependent upon each other. Okay, so there is a ratio called as testosterone estradiol ratio. Okay, and that, see, why this is relevant is, now see this chart. This chart is of importance. We get many of these patients nowadays. See, there was a nice review by again Ashok Agarwal and all, which said that obesity is a modern man's fertility nemesis. Why that is because when you have obesity, when there's insulin resistance, you metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes. See, so many of your males, just sit back in your OPD and you just look at it. So many of our males have these things. So when this is there, what happens is, ultimately, look at this picture. These people have low testosterone. Many of the times they just come and sit next to you and tell, Sadi ki liya, peti liya. They don't have interest. And then, and then they have more, they're low testosterone and ultimately more estradiol. So they'll behave very nicely and gently, perfectly gently behaving men, but ultimately having a reversal of testosterone estradiol. So that means in these patients, the testosterone estradiol ratio is altered. Okay, so that's what this ratio is supposed to be 10 ideally. Okay, so how do you arrive at 10? You're supposed to measure total testosterone. Anything below 300 is a reasonable cutoff to say that this man has got low testosterone. Okay, but then there's certain other things. You should take two measurements because testosterone assays are notoriously unreliable, and then combine it with a ratio with estradiol. And 10 10 testosterone 10, remember 10 is the figure to remember. Okay, so if the testosterone or estradiol ratio is altered or decreased, that means there is less testosterone, or there is, yeah. So when there's less testosterone, then you have different options in hand, right? Option is to increase the testosterone. Another option is that to you have to do something to decrease the estradiol, give anti-estrogens, or the enzyme which converts testosterone to estradiol, that is aromatase, you inhibit that enzyme. That is the three options. See, that is where most of the medicines in the market, you'll get the explanation. If you understood this concept of testosterone estradiol ratio, then the next, next few slides from here become very clear. Now, the initially what we used to do when I started practicing, that was maybe roughly around 22 years ago. Then that time, we used to use a lot of testosterone. Okay, there was this called direct therapy medicines like provironum and those kind of medicines, mestrolone, direct therapy, and then the testosterone increase. Some patient would benefit, but many patients would have a lot of damage because of that. Why that thing is because see, now there's a recommendation that you should not give exogenous testosterone therapy to men who are trying to conceive. Why? It can interrupt, normal spermatogenesis. Okay, so that it was likely to result in azoospermia, not in high doses, even in lower doses, because the dose response effect was not consistently seen. So how much ever you are tempted for an infertility patient, do not give testosterone to improve spermatogenesis. That's the message you take across. Then what do? Your testosterone estradiol ratio is altered. You need to increase the testosterone. If you cannot give testosterone, what else to do? Then came the idea of aromatase inhibitors. Okay, aromatase inhibitors we are very familiar with. There are different groups. Initially, there was only testolactone, formastine, and exemestane. But now there are non-steroidal options available like letrozole and anastrozole. Okay, the person who brought out this concept was Peter Schlegel. Weill Cornell University. He's one of the most famous andrologists. And then he found out, these men, these obese men with low testosterone, to reverse this, he started using this testolactone, which is very similar to our letrozole or anastrozole. Okay, and then he did find that when that was used, I'm not going into details of the study. Okay, then it was found that there was a very significant increase in testosterone. The TE ratio was changed. It was 5, it became 12, motility increased, and sperm concentration. So they concluded that aromatase inhibitors can improve semen parameters, but that was steroidal. We needed better, this options. So they concluded that you can use these aromatase inhibitors, and then started studies with using of letrozole. And when they started using letrozole 2.5 milligrams daily for more than 6 months, they found same results. That what everything changes. The testosterone estradiol ratio changes, and the testosterone increases. So then again, a lot of studies with esters and did not have many side effects and serious side effects. So again, here the conclusion was, you can use letrozole. Again, I'm telling you, it's specific therapy in patients whom the testosterone is less and where the testosterone estradiol ratio is changed. Then they thought that, okay, you said letrozole, why not anastrozole then? Because testosterone had the anti-cancer label on it. Why not use anastrozole? So then similar studies were done with anastrozole and they found very similar results. I'm not pausing at these slides. I just put it to see that, the way the thought processes evolve and how different medicines come into the picture. So if somebody tells you about the letrozole, anastrozole, it's the same effect. They are aromatase inhibitors, so they will reverse the testosterone estradiol ratio. Okay, so that is this thing. So a summary of all these, that's again a talk in itself. Aromatase inhibitors in male infertility. Okay, so here again, it's beneficial, and a summarization of all these talks, all these studies different is that aromatase inhibitors help. So tomorrow, if somebody asks you, that person is writing tamoxifen, that person is writing letrozole, how does it help? Here is your answer. Okay, you should be able to answer in this fashion. Similarly, regarding clomiphene, there was a question regarding clomiphene. See, your aromatase inhibitor will act at this level, conversion of testosterone to estradiol, but your SERMs or your anti-estrogens, directly you can decrease the estrogen to reverse the testosterone estradiol ratio. Okay, so they will act at the level of the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and then will give you similar effect. You can use clomiphene or its isomer like zooplomifene or n-clomiphene and tamoxifen for a continuous therapy of 3 to 6 months, and then see, many patients have these prescriptions and we all know it. So, evidence, again, American Urology Association says that, in patients that, you can use all these if to reverse the testosterone estradiol ratio. So I discussed two things. One is antioxidant. Second was the testosterone estradiol ratio. Now the third one is basics of gonadotropin therapy. See, you want to give gonadotropins, you should know a few basics. Okay. So what is gonadotropins? Gonadotropins basically HCG is the one. It is not HMG. It is HCG that is used because HCG has structure similar to LH. So, HCG will bind to LH receptors and increase the production of testosterone. Okay, so initial regimen of HCG is 1000 to 2000 administered IM 2 to 3 times a week. You have to monitor the clinical response, and every 2 to 3 months by serum testosterone levels or the size of the gonads. Okay, and then after that, that's called the induction phase. So there's an induction phase when the testosterone has normalized. When the testosterone is normalized, after that you go ahead and add your HMG or FSH. That is your, HMG is a combination of FSH and LH or this thing. See, this is one area where you should know the basics, but always you can have a reproductive endocrinologist to help you. You need monitoring for the patient for gynecomastia. You need to monitor the prostate. You'll be giving prolonged therapy with these medicines, liver function, renal function tests. All these things need to be managed. But you should know that HCG for a patient who is trying to become pregnant is definitely better than giving testosterone, because testosterone, remember, like I said, is a no for patients who are trying to become pregnant, because it may suppress your spermatogenesis. And this therapy takes time. Okay, it takes a time, it takes months, depending on, on this thing. The response is never sudden, or it's not never a tomorrow response. It takes time for the response to come. So that was about, basics of gonadotropin therapy. You don't need to know very high-fi in male infertility. Now, the biggest segment of the catchment area in male infertility and its medicines is your idiopathic causes, where you don't know any of the causes of the therapy and you just give a basket full of medicines. That's called empirical treatment. Okay. Now, see, empirical treatment, is it a promise or a panacea? It's much debated, and it's a matter of debate also, because see, in most of our prescriptions, if you introspect, you will have an antioxidant, you would have an antibiotic. Some of us would like to give some gonadotropin. Some of us would like to give some cyphine or clomiphene or some medicines like that. Some of us like tamoxifen. So is it that? So there have been attempts made. See, there's so many options for empirical and non-therapic therapies. See, all this is there, and every time somebody will comment, this is better, that is better. For male infertility, you write this, sperm count increases by this. But see, I highlight this study. It's from the European Association of Urology, and it's not an ordinary study. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis, and it's quite recent. It's from 2019. Okay, they try to see whether these empiric therapies have any benefit, and you just see this particular chart and you realize what's the problem. See, they started finding for these studies, and they started with a number of 5,660 studies. See, each medical representative who comes brings a pamphlet quoting a particular study. So there are thousands of such studies that are available. They screened 5,600 records, and they had to exclude 5,437 records. Okay, and they found only 226 of this. So from 5663, we narrowed to 226, which were eligible for even putting it into a meta-analysis. Okay, and then out of that, they again narrowed down to 61, because why? Most of the studies were, they were duplicates, they were non-comparative, sample size is too small, irrelevant. See, anytime somebody comes and tries to tell you that medicine X improves the sperm count by 15 million, 20 million, you ask that, do you have a study which has shown the pregnancy rates? Have the pregnancy rates improved because of your medicine? You will find that most of the time they will look at the sky and say, no, sperm count increased. Sperm count increase means actually nothing, and that is where the problem with this lies. So from that meta-analysis, there are a few conclusions. Okay, that when you're using injections, you should realize that there are studies which showed that the morphology improved, but the data on pregnancy were limited. Similarly, antioxidants like carnitine and coenzyme Q, data on pregnancy rates are limited. So you see, each and every conclusion here, you find that the data is limited, either based on historical data or not this thing. So you have to take each one of these studies with a pinch of salt. So when you write empirical medicines, you write a basket full of medicines, you must remember this, that that there may be evidence that they're beneficial, but there's very limited evidence that it leads to increase in rates of spontaneous pregnancy or pregnancy in ART or in live births. Count increase doesn't mean anything, because count is not the only thing that gives a pregnancy to a couple. So I think that I made my 4 points very clear. I think all the other things left around, you just have to remember four things. Once again, I would stress on those four things in the medical management of male infertility. Remember the oxidative stress word. Try and identify your patients who may be having oxidative stress. Second one is, don't overdo your antioxidants. Be very judicious when you're this. Second one is, you remember your testosterone estradiol ratio. Remember that that's a specific therapy for people who have low testosterone. So learn to identify people who have low testosterone and hypogonadic. Remember the testosterone estradiol ratio. Don't try to be ignorant about it or try to blah 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 when it comes to that. Be very focused when you want to write the medicine. Then the third thing that I discussed is you should have some fundamental basics for use of gonadotropins, and long-term gonadotropins are needed. They have to be monitored. And the fourth one is be very judicious and give empirical medical therapy with a pinch of salt. It's not that I don't write medicines for male infertility. I do write, and I also follow many of the things here. But then see, these are a few conclusions. Give patients very clear roadmap, talk to them clearly, and say that most of it is empirical unless you found out a definitive cause. You should have definite endpoints. And if you're giving medicines like antioxidants, give it for a sufficient course of time. If you're giving gonadotropins, give time for the results to show. If it doesn't improve, then you change track. Decide how many how much time you want to go on empirically treating a patient, and when you want to switch to ART. And don't waste precious time and money of patients with medical therapy when the circumstances call for assisted reproduction therapy. Thank you very much for a patient hearing, and I hope the time was well spent, and and this thing I tried. It was an enjoyable experience of preparing this presentation, and I hope that listening to it was also useful and beneficial to all of you. Thank you very much.
Anita Madam, Bimal.
Yeah, very well, well said, Dr. Venugopal. It's a very, even I was listening very intently. You have summarized everything very well, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. We have a lot of questions too. So would you enter the chat box, or shall I read it out for you?
I think Bimal can.
I'll stop share, and then I'll be able to see it.
Anita Madam.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to thank Dr. Venugopal. It's a very lucid presentation, and your take-home message was very clear and crisp. That's something which every practitioner should know. And this paradox, I recently heard of it somewhere about the overuse of antioxidants. That's why I asked you that question.
Yes,
Thank you for clearing that.
Yes, that message should go out very well. It's not okay to just go on prescribing antioxidants on and on. And then, the disturbing trend is, that many a times, maybe unwittingly, you find different permutations of and combinations of antioxidants with the patient. 3 or 4 things, combinations, and that should not be done. Okay, we may not do benefit to patient, but definitely our idea should be not to do any harm to the patient. So, because, whatever you say, patients are ready. And then there's a scientific basis for it also. It's not a bias.
Yeah, there are patients who take them hordes of medicines, and they say take it with them to Gulf and other areas. Yeah. Now, when do you call it stop when regarding antioxidants? Like you give empirically for OAT, and then when do you stop it? Like?
Yeah, I would give it empirically for OAT. I would generally, when I start, I tend to continue it for 3 months. Then after 3 months, again would have a discussion with the patient, and then see, discussion with the patient is very important. That's what I feel. That whatever if patient then if and like I said, there are many patients. There are many reasons which they choose a particular therapy. It can be because of their socio-economic problems. Some people just not able to go ahead with any other form of therapy. In which case, then you would say the biggest limitation I have found is always I was intrigued by the question that how do you know about oxidative stress? And then I think once the system like Meoxys comes, I think currently it's expensive, but once the system like that comes, I think that would be a game changer in this whole sort of a picture. As of now, like I said, I give it for 3 months, then review, have a discussion with the patient, maybe continue it for another 3 months. And then there are some people, all said and done, how much ever you counsel them, they like to go on continuing their medicines. I would generally, after 2 to 3 courses, discontinue it. Like I don't like to write that way. So
suppose the same patient is being taken for ART.
Yeah.
Would you continue it for till the ART is over?
Yes, yes. I would continue that medicine because see, by and large, lot of research. Last time also when we went to ESHRE, we find that oxidative stress it induces strand breaks in the DNA of the sperm. So there can be 2 types of strand breaks, single strand and double strand. So now the attempt is, even if you're doing DNA fragmentation assays, to find out the dsDNA, double-stranded DNA breaks, and then if they are there, it makes a
tube light.
Yeah, it makes sense to. I always continue. Yeah, I do.
The red light, the red switch.
Okay. I think some of the other questions. Best combination of antioxidants. I think you've already answered.
Yeah,
There's no real. It's a trial. Then PRP for non-obstructive azoospermia. Is there any experience?
No, I don't like to do any things which are standard of practice to any of my patients. So I don't consider PRP as a standard of practice because I think that at least for the young people in centers where there are large volume load of patients, maybe you can stick to study protocols and try and do interventions like PRP. But otherwise, most of the people will be having small things, and we should never by one paper or one particular talk or something take up anything which are not standards of practice. I think we should, when we started IVF, we were like that. There were protocols and things. There's a tendency to break, because somebody from a large center comes and says that they did 5 cases or 7 cases. But I've never done that. Sorry, I've been practicing for few things, and I think that should be the message. I
Good
think
point.
Sheila ma'am is here. All seniors would agree to that particular.
Surely. How to measure intratesticular testosterone? Is there any?
No, at present we are just seeing serum testosterone total. I just showed it on one of my slides. That's the only way in which you could possibly do that.
Okay, that's another question. Dose of letrozole for males.
Yeah, I put that 2.5 milligrams once a day for minimum of 6 weeks. They've done it to 3 months. But I must tell you once again, I put it there not as an empirical therapy. That was a very specific therapy for a patient in whom the testosterone estradiol ratio is altered. Unless you've done that, you should think your empirical therapy should be based on your own judgment. Okay, that is for patients in whom, yeah, especially the obese males. See, many of us, we have these patients, obese males who are having a little bit of the metabolic syndrome. They'll be very gentle people. You can, without measuring testosterone, also sometimes you can identify these males. I'm telling you, they will come very soft spoken. The wife will do most of the talking and they'll be very nice. That's because of estradiol predominance over testosterone. So please mark them for letrozole or something so that they will benefit from that therapy probably. Yeah. So that's specific therapy. Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of other questions which are not related to your talk. I don't know if I should.
If there is time, I don't mind. I don't mind. I enjoy.
Time is there. Time is there.
Okay, so there's another question. Dose and duration of, it's from Anita ma'am. It's a dose and duration of HCG. Do you go?
No, that is answered, Vimal.
Yeah.
Oh, that is earlier one. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think.
Yeah, see, HCG, different people do it in different ways. See, ideally what's described always is that you start with 1,500 to 2,000 units and you give it twice a week, okay? But then there are many people, I saw a recent Chinese study in which they were using 5,000 units once a week. So maybe that's because of the availability of HCG is more easier in 5,000 unit dosages. So, but the important thing is you give and then you have to monitor testosterone levels. And then after that, you have to start adding an HMG once the testosterone level. It's easier said than done. I think those type of cases of pure hypogonadotropic hypogonadism are best handed over to a reproductive endocrinologist. They do it really well, and once it's okay, it comes back to you. It's nice. But there's another use. See, many people don't do it because of hypogonadism. They give empirical HCG. And then that empirical HCG is the one, where its benefit is sort of question mark. Either you have not diagnosed the condition properly. See, many of these obese males and all whom I described, they are cases also of secondary hypogonadism. That is because of their obesity, they have hypogonadism. That may be the group where such sort of empirical therapy works because you've not got your TE ratios and your diagnosis of altered TE ratios correct. So there again, I think you should, if you started empirically, and then also in azoospermia, I've seen some people who do microdissection PISA. Before that, they use this HCG for preparing the patients before sperm aspiration and all that. But by and large, again, in the realms of research.
Okay.
Yeah, this question of pre-pubertal versus post-pubertal hypogonadism, hypo. See, the post-pubertal, there's something called primary and secondary hypogonadism. That's what I was mentioning about. The secondary hypogonadism, you can even see it in very adult people, secondary to pituitary disorders, even in adult people. That slide which I showed you is an adult person with hypogonadism because, of this, they may be normogonadistic or slightly hypogonadotropic. So, there again, you can use injections like HCG and add on HCG.
I think that's about it, the questions.
Yeah, I hope the concepts got clear. See, problem with male infertility is, many a time gynecologists, what they do is they either write off to a urologist or they believe more of a medical representative sort of biased these things. It's good. Medical representatives are our well-wishers, and that's fine. But we should have our concepts and things in place. Then I think we are benefited by that exercise. So it's not preaching idealism, all right. So it's,
No, but this talk, I think, generally puts everything in perspective for us.
Yeah.
We will also know better how